So I understand that you're a person with a rather extraordinary biography, and that fate led you to meet another extraordinary person, Viktor Ivanovich. I'd like you to recall some past moments and, of course, to tell us about your relationship, your vision, especially considering that you're a recognized specialist in these fields. What would you say about Viktor Ivanovich? What kind of person is he? What is this whole phenomenon? I found out recently, completely by chance, that it turns out that Viktor Ivanovich and I are from the same Ukrainian city, and in St. Petersburg, at the time Leningrad. We arrived at a different time, but we arrived in order to find a life path in this wonderful city. No one helped us. I was accepted into the Naval Medical Academy. Viktor Ivanovich made his own way, and we met near the late 50s or early 60s probably. No, we met in the 60s, when he was a student at the School of Psychology of Leningrad University. And my teacher, here's the face of the wonderful Bekhterev, and Vladimir Nikolaevich Misishev, my teacher. He in large part made it possible for Viktor Ivanovich to be accepted into Leningrad University. He wrote a special letter about his, to put it bluntly, unusual hypnotic abilities. And so he was enrolled as a student of the School of Psychology, which had been opened relatively recently. That was in '66, and in the next few years he became a student at the School of Psychology. Such schools were opened in Moscow University, and in Leningrad University. What were those unusual abilities? How did that become clear? What happened is that Vladimir Nikolaevich asked him to demonstrate a hypnotic seance. That took place, well, it could have been shown. There's an entrance from the second floor to our wing, the so-called round classroom, where Bekhterev, the founder of this institute, carried out his famous seances of collective hypnotherapy for alcoholics. That was the beginning of collective hypnosis in our country. Well, everyone always remembers that because the accomplished scientist, psychiatrist, neuromorphologist, psychologist Bekhterev also practiced psychotherapy, which at the time was expressed in an interest in hypnotherapy, in suggestion, in self-suggestion. And so in this classroom, Viktor Ivanovich was presented with a patient. We have a certain notion of poorly hypnotizable patients who can be hypnotized only with great difficulty. And Viktor Ivanovich asked for a patient like that, because he wanted to demonstrate what he could do with patients like that. And he hypnotized him, and then two chairs were placed beside him. A cataleptic bridge, when a person can function without hypnosis, without catalepsy. He can't remain in that horizontal position when his head and legs are on different chairs. That always makes a great impression, and there's an element of variety show hypnosis there, one of the elements of variety show hypnosis. And so Viktor Ivanovich demonstrated his hypnotic abilities on that patient. And that's very important, because Vladimir Nikolaevich was a rather accomplished scientist. Misishev was the director of that institute for 20 years. I was accepted in '57 to postgraduate studies under his tutelage, and a little later fate brought Viktor Ivanovich together with Misishev, and he made it possible for him to get into the university. Later, during his student years at the university, Viktor Ivanovich, like every student, wrote term papers and then his thesis. What I'd like to say is that there are different kinds of approaches to that wonderful creative propensity to invention. And sometimes it happens in a person's middle years, when some gift suddenly reveals itself in someone. The gift of an artist, of a musician, a composer, and so on. Viktor Ivanovich's creative nature was expressed already in those years, and the matter isn't in hypnosis, of course, but in the device that he made for his term and thesis papers. For that time, it was a good device, an electronic device that allowed you to determine the number of degrees of suggestion in a person, of suggestion and self-suggestion, which to this day is most often determined with the help of questionnaires. A patient is asked questions, he responds, and on that basis, or with the help of tests, special tests used in hypnosis. So Viktor Ivanovich created this device, created it himself or had it made based on his blueprints, because it was of very high quality, and that device became the foundation of his term and thesis papers. His thesis paper was very interesting. The fact of the matter is that usually students, whether they be in university or already writing their thesis, they stay on the beaten path and on some offshoot do their thesis. For a university, a thesis paper is a good independent study, carried out under the direction of the main instructors. And I took note of Viktor Ivanovich's paper because for 10 years, outside of the Petrik Institute, I worked at the School of Psychology of the university. I underwent the assistant's path there. I was a junior postgraduate, junior senior director of the branch in '69. And there I was an assistant, associate professor, and professor. What's more, I became a professor at the university earlier than I did at the Petrik Institute. And I was a teacher, of course. I had students who were writing their thesis, and not one of them. Viktor Ivanovich was one of them. And when that exam period began, when we accept thesis papers, I noticed then that Viktor Ivanovich's paper was probably the best that year. And then, this always happens with university students. Scientific work and publications are always encouraged, and that's done together with or without the teachers or thesis advisors. And Viktor Ivanovich took my advice and wrote 2 summaries of his thesis, and they, I'd like to emphasize, weren't just summaries. The way that nowadays tens of hundreds of conferences are carried out and anything at all can be put in them. No, these were proper summaries, and both of them were done well. They were made for the Pan-Soviet Scientific Conference, not even Russian, but Pan-Soviet, which means that the editing board that chooses the summaries had to evaluate them before putting them in its materials. And so they underwent review, were published, and I referenced these summaries in my book on medical psychology. That's another set of memories that have to do with that book. Here there's a section that touches on suggestion, and on page 64, among a series of investigations, we note the work carried out in our clinic by Viktor Ivanovich Petrik. That was in 1979. The methodology incorporated something in itself, and so on. So what I mean is that there was room for his work in the book, which is one of 3 books that for me are, of course, very important, a trilogy. The first book was about neuroses, the second about medical psychology, and the third about psychotherapy. And the psychotherapy book, I can say that at the psychology contest of the century, it won a Golden Psyche for most read book. And that book was the second designed by Viktor Ivanovich. This wonderful design was made and surprised me because I already knew then that he makes violins, that he restores paintings wonderfully. I already knew that in those years. And then I found out that he's a book designer as well. And when he offered to do it, I was surprised. This is the best design in the trilogy. So his creativity was evident both in the creation of this device and in the creation of this book. What I mean to say is that the path he's on in life wasn't the result of a sudden burst, when he began to suddenly offer up his inventions, that any academician, not just me, would regard as genius. That lifeline, the creative one, is a striving to traverse unbeaten roads, and could already be seen when he was still at university. That's his lifeline. He was a modest person, he didn't stand out. You know, there are students whom everyone knows. They strive in every way to show what they're doing and attract attention to what they do. No, that was not inherent in him. It was more that that device was noted by me, and that those materials for publication in the conference were inspired by me. That doesn't mean that he wanted to go down that path. I took note of that myself. And so that period, no one can really know it because it was long ago. And it's interesting that two people crossed his path at that time. My teacher, the great scientist Vladimir Nikolaevich Misishev, a direct student of Bekhterev, and later me, as one of Misishev's disciples. Tell us a little about the story of how Misishev and Viktor Ivanovich worked together. I understand that there was something interesting there. No. Vladimir Nikolaevich was... it's just his character. He was a rather careful person, a little aloof from other people, although he was not just an accomplished scientist, but an accomplished organizer as well. He was the director of our institute for 20 years, the hardest years, the years of the Pavlov session, and the years after that. He had to save the institute because other institutions that didn't follow Pavlov's path, because it's known, widely known, that Bekhterev and Pavlov had a feud. And Pavlov didn't like Bekhterev, and Misishev ran it in the 40s, the second half of the 40s during the famous Pavlov session. The attempt to make Pavlov's teachings the literal ideology, not just of our medicine, physiology, but to transpose that onto the philosophical methodology that we used at the time. Therefore, I'd like to emphasize that Misishev was a great person. He saved the Institute in those difficult years, took it through those reefs. And so he was an Institute director with a mass of students, and for him it was very important to advance and save the Institute. Vladimir Nikolaevich headed that branch when I started my postgraduate studies, and so any encounter with that person was a great one for me. For example, when I was going through the entrance exams for postgraduate studies, and I was told that he'd be present. In those years, he was still the department head of psychology at Leningrad University. I was told that Vladimir Nikolaevich would arrive and decide my fate when I was going through those entrance exams. So the fact that he touched upon Viktor Ivanovich's life is already important, because that wasn't often, not just at the level of students, but at the level of scientists as well. Vladimir Nikolaevich was a true scientist, a member of the intelligentsia with the corresponding behavior. Viktor Ivanovich told us a story about some patients, about how he tried... No, that's what I said. That Vladimir Nikolaevich, who knew, because he was told at the place where Viktor Ivanovich studied, when he was accepted into the college, he was told that he has uncommon hypnotic abilities. And Vladimir Nikolaevich decided to test them. And that's why here in our Ron Bekhterev classroom, he suggested that Viktor Ivanovich carry out a hypnosis session. And I repeat, Viktor Ivanovich said, "I'll carry out a hypnosis session, but give me the least hypnotizable patient, so that I can really prove that I'm above the average hypnotist, who sometimes manages to hypnotize patients and sometimes doesn't." He managed just fine with a very difficult and non-hypnotizable patient. And this was in the presence of Vladimir Nikolaevich and the students of Leningrad University, who were being given a lecture here in this classroom by Vladimir Nikolaevich at the time. And what were your impressions after the séance? The impression was, of course, astonishing, because to achieve catalepsy, that bridge, in any patient, in any hypnotized person, that's a real accomplishment. You can see that in textbooks on hypnosis. Not every hypnotist can achieve that, even if he has a strong hypnosis technique. There's such a notion as therapeutic hypnosis. That's when we don't even strive to have the patient enter into a hypnotic state. The first stage of hypnosis is just to lie calmly and listen to our voice. He enters into an intermediate state between sleeping and waking. The later stages of hypnosis have to do with the creation of a rapport exclusively between the hypnotized and the one hypnotizing him, and he hears only his commands and carries out his commands. In variety show hypnosis, they use that moment in particular, when they transfer a person to another year in his life, when they impose new relationships on him and so on. Viktor Ivanovich demonstrated that he is a master of classical hypnosis, as a major specialist. And let's take into account that this was the beginning of his encounter with medicine, with psychology, or with medicine from the standpoint of psychotherapy. I'd like to say a couple more words about how when the question arises of how there are people who are natural-born hypnotizers, or whether it's something attainable. The thing is that medical hypnosis doesn't necessarily require the technique of immersing the patient into a hypnotic state, in which anything at all can be done with him.
Обязательно техники погружения человека, больного, погружения его в стадию гипноза, когда можно сделать с ним, по сути, все что угодно.
Although there is such a rule that a patient will never do anything that would go against his moral principles, his aesthetic principles, and so on.
Моральных каких-то требований, эстетических требований и так далее. Но тем не менее, конечно, все-таки вот.
But nevertheless, even with that limitation, he will carry things out not just directly, but at a distance as well, via post-hypnotic suggestion. A week and a month later, they can find themselves under the influence of the formula of suggestion that was offered and imposed. And so I'd like to say that when we evaluate a person's abilities, it's a difficult question. The correlation between nature and nurture. I don't know, and no one knows the correlation. In any case, when we take that up in medicine, it's a very difficult question. It seems to me that the prerequisites for becoming a great hypnotizer should be present after birth. Perhaps it's a peculiarity of personality, a peculiarity of character, a peculiarity of behavior. It's what will help to implement these abilities later in life. In that way, I think that Viktor Ivanovich met all of those requirements. So those prerequisites were there, but he also worked on his hypnosis technique, of course, as I later learned.
Потом я узнал, что он работает над техникой гипноза, и, конечно же, это должно быть разработано, да, ничего не дается так просто.
And of course it should be developed. Nothing is done that easily. Vladimir Nikolaevich offered everyone to carry it out in the Bekhterev classroom, where Bekhterev... Everyone knew that it was in this classroom that Bekhterev carried out the first session of mass hypnosis. That was its own sort of recognition. Because if a person is asked to repeat hypnosis, because Bekhterev was a great hypnotist, then I think that really says something. And he did it twice, too. That time it was the hypnosis of a patient, but then it was repeated over the course of his work on his thesis and term papers, when he stood out among the other students with his great creativity. That scientific thirst that often... It was completely present even then. In order to make that device, in order to go ahead and do research with the help of that device, a phenomenon like suggestion is very complex, and it was necessary to have some intentions, motivation, and aspirations for it. That's why I said that he was a creative person even then, although he hadn't made the discoveries that academics are paying attention to now. You know, I'm not an engineer, so it's difficult for me to assess what Viktor Ivanovich has done in the fields of science and technology, in the border area between physics, chemistry, and industry.
науки, техники в этой пограничной области между физикой, химией, производством. Ну, это фантастика, да. И я не
I
могу
can't give
сам
my
допустить
opinions
своих
because I'm not a
сотрудников, я не
specialist.
специалист. Я
I'm a
специалист
specialist and expert in my
в своей
field,
области. И поэтому ориентировался я,
and that's why Victor Ivanovich's encounter
конечно
with
же,
those 5
на меня большое
academics made a large
впечатление
impression on me,
произвела встреча Виктора Ивановича
especially
с
since there were 4 academics
5
from the large academy.
академиками. Причем там было 4, по-моему, академика большой академии. Да, мы говорим большой, потому что
We say large because that's the last
конечный
step in recognition in science,
путь
membership in the
признания,
academy.
да, членства в академии.
And one of them was an
Я один
associate
большой
member,
корреспондент,
and
причем
one was the vice
один из
president
них
of that
был
big academy,
вице-президентом вот
which
этой
to me is
большой
already a lot.
академии, что для меня это уже запредельно, да. Вице-президент
A vice
это
president is a person whose presence you pray for,
человек, на которого
because he's a major specialist in these fields.
молиться, потому что крупнейший специалист в этих областях, да, и 3 других были, по-моему,
And the other 3 were
директорами
directors of institutes of special chemical problems and so on.
химии, химических проблем и так далее. И вот то, как
And I saw
они,
the cassette, the way that they talked about
как
it,
они
about those
говорили об
inventions, about Viktor Ivanovich, I was amazed, to be honest.
о Викторе Ивановиче, меня это поразило, честно говоря. Потому что
Because here I'd like to say a few words about how when Viktor Ivanovich meets specialists and normal people, with specialists of any level, when we have a certain phenomenon of a transfer set,
специалистами любых уровней, то у нас есть такой так называемый
then we have a certain phenomenon of a transfer set in psychotherapy,
что мы должны
that I as a psychotherapist should control the emotional reactions that arise in me in relation to a patient.
те эмоциональные реакции, которые
Because a patient can be a
возникают по
psychopath
отношению к этому
and have
больному.
psychopathic
Больной
reactions.
может быть и психопатом, с психопатическими реакциями.
In that case, I feel negativity towards him and aggression, and I should control that, because to me he's a patient. I should perceive him positively. I should be authentic and genuine with him, and I should empathize with him, because he's a patient, in terms of psychotherapy. And so when Viktor Ivanovich meets with any person, including when I hear about his discoveries, then that set of transfer reactions arises. It's surprise, here I wrote it. Surprise, irritation, negation, hostility. Maybe I should control it myself. What amazed me about the academics was that they didn't know what a transfer set is, and that's why in psychotherapy I should possess that. I should be conscious and possess that set of transfer reactions. I said that for me it's a patient. I should pass the golden rule of psychotherapy to him. Perceive him positively, be genuine in conversation with him, and empathize with him as a person. And so the academics didn't know that. And it amazed me that when they talk about how the discussion is on the essence of genius inventions, then from the mouth of a person who went through that difficult path in science, who broke out into the ranks of famous scientists, of authorities in that field, and when they say that about Viktor Ivanovich, for me it's an amazing discovery that academics, as self-sufficient people, as people who know what they're worth, depart from that set of transfer reactions. I didn't hear any negation, any aggression, any hostility from their mouths. I could have heard it, but I didn't. That to me was almost a discovery. And there are people who are at a high level of scientific knowledge and search for truth, that they deviate from what for us is normal, typical, when we're talking not just about a conversation with a patient in the course of psychotherapy, but a simple conversation with another person who is sharing with us his achievements, as I understand them.
Разговор с другим человеком, который делится с нами своими достижениями, как я воспринимаю эти достижения. И вот эти эмоциональные реакции, они, конечно, должны контролироваться.
And so these emotional reactions should be controlled. And the academics, I repeat, they didn't know this. But they behaved in accordance with those rules that we tried to use in the process of psychotherapy for it to be effective. And so I don't doubt so much as an iota that some people can make mistakes in their appraisals. And I say this and repeat it because these discoveries are astounding on a certain level, where even though I'm not a physicist, even though I'm not a chemist, I understand what a discovery is, what it means to make a discovery in different fields of knowledge. There is a sort of general culture.
Я не являюсь ни физиком, ни химиком, но я все-таки понимаю, что такое открытие, что такое изобретение. В разных областях знаний есть же какая-то общая культура.
And when they talk about it, then that of course is a very high appraisal, a very high one.
Конечно, очень высокая оценка, очень высокая. Ну, они почти каждый
And
говорили
almost
об
all of them
этом.
talked about it.
Ну, не все,
Not
во
all of
всяком
them,
случае,
but some of
некоторые.
them.
И,
And
конечно
of
же,
course the
возникает
question
вопрос
arises
о
of what
том,
exactly is
что,
happening.
что же происходит, да, на самом деле каждое открытие
The
могло
thing is that
изменить
every discovery could have changed a certain area of work, and not just in the field of the
направление
advancement of
работы,
scientific
причем не
knowledge in that
только в
area,
области
but in the field of
развития
implementing that
научных
knowledge in
знаний
real
в этом
life,
направлении,
and
но
it's
и
up
в
to them.
области
They said
внедрения в
that, not me.
практику этих знаний.
To change
И
entire
за
areas in
ними,
science,
это
in
они
industry.
говорили, не я, стоит преобразование целых направлений науки и производства, да, и когда, ну да, я знаю, что некоторые его открытия, да, изобретения, открытия,
Yes,
они
I know that
приводят
some of his
к
inventions and
какой-то
discoveries have been
дело в
implemented to
том,
some
что они
degree.
говорили о том, что
But the
последовательное
thing is that
движение
they
в этом
said that the
направлении
subsequent
могло
movements in that
преобразовать
direction could
какие-то
radically change
отрасли,
some branches of agriculture and industry.
хозяйства, да,
Radically
производства,
change.
преобразовать. То есть это очень соответствует тому, что сейчас много говорится о нанотехнологии,
That very
а
much
ты знаешь, работать
corresponds to what a lot of
конечного
people are saying about
науки. И
nanotechnology.
когда все время
And
говорят
Viktor
о
Ivanovich is, of course, working at the level of
инновационных
nanotechnology.
преобразованиях в нашей экономике.
And when
И
all the
тогда
time they
возникает
talk
вопрос о
about
том,
innovative
почему
radical
же
changes in our
не
technology.
появляются люди, которые буквально берут под руки Виктора
And
Ивановича
then the
и
question
берут
arises of why there
в свои
aren't any people who
лаборатории,
would literally carry
конструкторские
Viktor Ivanovich and
организации,
take him to their
технологические
laboratories,
учреждения для того,
construction
чтобы реализовать
organizations, technological institutions, in order to bring them
тогда,
to life.
конечно же, у меня есть свой собственный
And
опыт
then, of course, I have
осмысления
my own
этого.
personal experience of
Он
comprehending
связан,
this.
конечно, с тем,
It
что
has
я
to do, of
видел,
course, with
я
what I've seen
слышал.
and heard.
И
We have 2
2
minutes.
минуты займет у нас.
It was a
Это
wonderful
замечательный
film, and it
фильм.
made an
И на меня
impression.
он произвел впечатление. Это движение нашей
The
страны
movement
к
in our country
перестройке,
towards
уже
perestroika,
ближе к
already
перестройке.
close to
И
perestroika,
показывают фильм,
and they
который
show a
никто не
film that no one
помнит. Я
remembers,
запомнил
but I
его.
remember it.
Заседание парткома и
A session
секретарь
of the
обкома
party
партии
committee and the secretary of the regional
рассказывает, что
committee of the
вот
party
там
tells
сидят
us of how there are
хозяйственники,
agriculturists there,
партийные деятели,
party
и
workers,
говорят о том, что вот
and he tells of how
они
within the
в рамках
framework of the city building and business, they created a major industry,
предприятия
began
создали
creating a major
крупные
industry in some
производства,
city,
начали создавать крупные
in order
производства
to create an
в каком-то
industry
городе.
and
И
work
тогда
on it.
уже для того, чтобы создавать производство, чтобы работать потом на нем, там появились тысячи людей, которые снялись с своих
Thousands
мест
of
и
people
приехали,
showed
чтобы
up, who
работать
left
в
their
этом
homes and arrived to work in
городе.
that city.
И
And it
оказывается,
turns out
что
that a
была
mistake was made and that it's
ошибка,
very
что
difficult to
очень
bring
дорого
ore to that
везти
city
его
from
в
remote
этот город
places,
из
and that it needs to be
отдаленных
made
мест, что
closer
нет,
to
надо
those
было
regions
все
of the
это
country
делать
that have
ближе
one.
к тем регионам страны, где есть руда. И тогда возникает
And so the
вопрос,
question
что же
arises
мы
of what are we
будем
going to tell the
говорить этим
workers, that
рабочим,
technical
этим
personnel that left their
техническому
homes and
персоналу,
moved to this
которые
city.
бросили
And I
насиженные
was
места и
shocked.
приехали в этот город. И меня поразило, ну, учтем
Let's
нашу
take into account
психологию,
our
да,
psychology,
это
and
сейчас
that we're a
мы
little
немножко
more free in our
свободнее
reactions.
в своих оценках. А тогда первый обком партии
And then the first
сказал,
committee of the
что
party
мы им
said,
скажем,
what will we tell
мы
them?
скажем им
We'll tell them
правду.
the truth.
Мы скажем им правду. И я подумал, что это легко
And I
сказать,
thought
мы скажем им правду.
that that's easy to say.
Это же не
We'll tell them the
вопрос не
truth.
только социальной психологии,
It's
это
a question not just of social
вопрос,
psychology, a political question as well.
я не знаю,
What do you mean we'll
да,
tell them?
что значит скажем? Там
There are
несколько
several
тысяч
thousand
людей,
people
которым
who need to be
сказать, что они
told that they
должны
should go wherever they
ехать,
want,
куда они хотят, да? И ничем им
and that no one
помочь
can really
не
help them
может,
in any
очень
way.
много. И я подумал,
And I thought that in that
об этом,
conversation between Viktor
шла речь в
Ivanovich and the
беседе Виктора Ивановича
academics,
с академиками,
that was brought up,
что
that they noticed
они
that,
обращали внимание
had
на
that
то,
question,
они
what do you
не
mean,
сделали это так
implement each of these
просто, как я буду
inventions,
говорить, что
even if it didn't happen quite like
что
that.
значит вот внедрить каждое из этих изобретений? Значит, нужны миллионы, может быть, миллиарды рублей для
That
того,
means that
чтобы
it's necessary to find millions,
доработать то, что
billions of
требует
rubles
вот
in order to
научного
bring about what
такого
such a
последовательного
systematic scientific
образования,
grounding
что могут
demands.
сделать, ну, представители классических школ физики, химии.
It's one thing for representatives of the classical
Но
school
что
of
это
physics,
значит
of
потом?
chemistry,
Это значит
institute
внедрить.
directors to say that.
Тогда это отменит
But what does later
то
mean? What
производство,
does
которое
implement them
сегодня
mean?
существует, на котором
Because maybe
заняты
industry will
тысячи,
cancel
может,
it,
десятки тысяч
because it
людей,
might
но
take
построить
thousands,
новое
might take
производство.
tens of thousands of people.
Кто же сегодня
It
может
might
себе
mean building new
позволить
factories.
выбросить на улицу
And who today can allow himself to throw thousands, tens of thousands of people out on the streets and tell them that for this nanotechnology we don't need thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, we need hundreds of people.
сотни людей. Поэтому происходит такой разрыв между
And so a
тем,
great
что
rupture takes place
декларируется,
between
и
what
тем,
is
что
declared
можно
and what can actually be
сделать.
done.
Когда говорят, я
And so
слушаю,
when people talk, I hear our president,
президента,
our head of government,
слушаю и главу правительства, и
and
они
all the
всё
time
время
they
об
talk
этом
about it,
говорят,
and we see the
и мы
story
видим
slip,
все, что
because it doesn't
это,
happen that quickly.
история буксует, да, что не происходит все это так быстро, да. И тогда я, конечно, вот для себя
And then I brought that down all the way to Viktor
опустился
Ivanovich
до Виктора Ивановича и подумал, что это
and thought that
очень
it's not simple.
дело даже не в деньгах,
And it's not even the money.
что затрагиваются интересы
It's in the fact that it affects the interests of thousands of people. And that's without even mentioning the business owner. He, of course, that was apparent in the Sayano-Shukhin hydroelectric station, when they tried to use a hydroelectric station despite it obviously needing repairs in order to get money, when what had to be done was to stop it and study its technical state, to change some blocks. That demands colossal investments. And even understanding that, people don't always go down that path. It's a very difficult path, psychologically difficult, socially difficult. And that's why the relationship between the administration of a country and businessmen, proprietors of the main institutions, is very complex. That's what you said about how, from the standpoint of psychology, Viktor Ivanovich can often be perceived quite negatively. I made notes on purpose so as not to take up a lot of time. Surprise, irritation, negation, and hostility. If these aren't self-sufficient academics, let's imagine that they're average-level scientists with average knowledge. And so they hear that their whole lives they've been doing science in closed fields and can't do anything. Because why should I even say it? You yourself understand that there aren't very many truly talented people, accomplished people in the population. It would be horrible if there were many of them. There are few. And that's why Viktor Ivanovich isn't 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000. He might be 1 in 1,000, maybe 1 in... You know, one of the academics talked about Edison, and Edison didn't have a classical scientific background in his scientific preparation either. Postgraduate studies, junior, senior professor, academic, he doesn't have that preparation. Well, Edison didn't have that preparation either, but he gave humanity a whole series of inventions that completely changed people's lives. Not long ago, there was a film about Tesla, about the great inventor Tesla. How he blew up the Tunguska meteorite? Well, let that be a hypothesis. But just the very scale of that person, he wasn't a classical scientist. He was a great inventor. So it's a phenomenon of an unacknowledged genius. Acknowledged by a great number of people. I'm not even saying by everyone, because that's just impossible. Because there's always a question about what I did and what Viktor Ivanovich did, an attempt to compare it. I won't hide the fact that I sometimes have such thoughts, because it's one thing to make a major discovery, and a different thing is even my path. I should be satisfied with my path. I became first in my field. I became the leading psychotherapist in the country, and that's recognized. And it allowed the formation of new, contemporary Russian psychotherapy. That's also recognized. But I think that you understand what I'm trying to say. That the discovery of the incandescent light bulb is one thing, and there are also some events that later find a place in the history of humanity when something changes. Medicine is something else, where we move not at the fastest of paces because a person is a very complex phenomenon, especially the psychological features of a person. The personality features of a person. That's the most difficult object of knowledge. Here we move at a much slower pace, so that comparison of a great inventor, a genius inventor, with what I think about my own life path, can't help but bring about that set of transferred reactions that I talked about. It's simpler for me, because the process of psychotherapeutic training makes me conscious of them and makes me overcome them. Because otherwise I won't be able to be a good psychotherapist. I won't be able to speak with patients and treat them. I'm talking about this because here there might be the psychology of the discovery, human psychology. These things can be taken differently, but they can also be taken from the standpoint of personality psychology, of social psychology. Your assessment of Viktor Ivanovich's activity, if you will. It's clear that you're not a scientist, neither a physicist or a chemist, but in general, after so many years. He's been before your eyes for over 30 years, almost 40. In general, how would you assess the Viktor Ivanovich phenomenon?
Я могу то... Нет. Я могу только повторить то, что я
I
слышал.
can only repeat what I've heard.
Кажется, что это
I think this isn't a word that should be used lightly,
не стоит
but I
разбрасывать
think that his
слов,
inventions are
но это на
genius.
уровне гениальных, конечно, изобретений. Потому что все-таки я, во-первых, я был
First
в
of all,
лаборатории, я
I
видел
was in his laboratory and
целого ряда
I witnessed a whole series of discoveries that Viktor Ivanovich has made. There's no trick. I saw his systematic approach to that discovery and his attempt. Apropos, some of the people I saw on the cassettes offer Viktor Ivanovich work, and that means that, if you'll forgive me, someone might steal them.
Виктором Ивановичем, и это еще раз говорит о том, что Виктор Иванович не просто изобретатель, который прячет свои изобретения, потому что их кто-то может, прошу прощения, кто-то может украсть. Нет, его это не беспокоит. Он готов
No,
сотрудничать
he
с
isn't worried
учеными,
about
с
that.
академиками, чтобы...
He's ready to work with
Потому что, мне
scientists, with
кажется, для
academics,
такого человека
because it seems to me that for someone like him, the discovery itself is
но
important.
еще более важно, что те силы,
But still more
которые он
important is that the
затратил,
effort that he
время,
put
которое
into
он
it,
затратил,
the time that he
они
put into
должны
it,
быть
should lead to something that can exist in real life,
реализованы в жизни, да, в жизни людей,
in people's
в
lives,
экономике, в каких-то других.
in economics, in some other
Мне
fields.
кажется, что, может быть,
And it
вот
seems to me that Viktor Ivanovich's problem
проблема
might be that he
Виктора
wants to see
Ивановича
his
не только его
inventions.
одного.
He
Это
wants them to be
проблема,
seen
чтобы
and noted,
видеть
for them to be
свои
necessary, and it's not the money.
изобретения,
I don't think so.
ну, чтобы они были оценены, чтобы они были нужны. И дело совсем не в деньгах, мне кажется. Нет.
He wants what he spent his life, or half his life, or part of his life on to be necessary. Necessary to people, and necessary to his country.
Что это нужно. Нужно людям. Нужно моей стране, нужно людям. Я привел пример.
I drew a comparison with this film when it talked about how we'll tell people the truth, and also on the road to that transition in our country from the Soviet Union that already began in Perestroika. And there are certain things that get deposited in our memory.
Отлагаются вот в памяти. Выдающийся изобретатель
A great inventor of Armenia is visited by a Russian journalist. He arrives in Yerevan, and the inventor demonstrates a whole series of inventions, some that are true discoveries. And the journalist asks him, and can all of this be implemented in people's lives? That man was ill. After an operation, he spoke only in a whisper. There was some pathology there related to his throat. And he whispered that no one needs any of it. No one is interested in it. No one needs it.
Никто не интересуется этим. Это никому не нужно. И вот тогда вот этот вот его шепотный такой вскрик.
And his whispered scream that no one needs it.
Это ведь, да, Виктор Иванович может сказать, что частично.
So Viktor Ivanovich can say that these inventions can be implemented in real life, but he didn't count on all of this happening. All of this happening in the sense that he's doing it.
Все это происходит, да? Происходит в том смысле, что он это делает. И поэтому как бы на меня не произвело
And so that meeting with the academics didn't make an impression on me.
изобретателя, конечно же, важно не то, что
For a genuine inventor, of course, it's not important, not just for them to note it or not. There are tons of people who will think that it's not clear and who will look for a trick in it. But it's impossible after the academics to look for a trick every time, because I always transfer that to my reactions, and I try to understand the reactions of other people to it from the standpoint of personality psychology, from the standpoint of depth psychology. That's what I can say about it. Is there anything else you'd like to say? A question, perhaps, that I didn't ask you? No. If you don't have any questions, then I think not. There were two main things that I wanted to discuss. Viktor Ivanovich's life before the people found out about him, and what these discoveries mean, how people might react to them. Because the difficulties that he encounters have to do with psychology.